Energy Media readers, it's election night 2019, October 21st, and we have with us Michael Bernstein, who's an economist with the Canadians for Clean Prosperity. We've talked to Michael a number of times about climate and energy policies during the campaign, so welcome, Michael.
Good to be here.
Now, we're early in the returns. We're only seeing at this point Atlantic Canada, but the Liberals are doing very well. And they were expected to do well, but I don't know if they were expected to do this well. What role have climate plans, climate change, climate science played in the campaign out in Atlantic Canada?
Well, so we'll obviously know that better once we have a bit of a post-mortem on this, but the early indications, which we have to rely on polling to assess, is that climate change was actually one of the very top issues for folks in Atlantic Canada. Abacus data, for example, put out released results on Sunday showing that of those, when they aggregated up all the people who told them their top 5 issues, climate change was right at the top. This was across the country, but we know Atlantic Canada tends to overperform, I suppose, on the climate change metric. So it looks like that is likely to be a big factor. You're also seeing the Green Party, although they're not winning any seats, gaining a vote share in Atlantic Canada, which tells you that very likely climate change was a big factor, a big motivator in a lot of people's votes.
Well, that's very interesting. We'll be keeping a close eye on that as the evening progresses. Well, let's turn our attention to Quebec and Ontario. And you're based in Toronto, so let's start there.
Right.
What's the 411 and the 416, as it were?
Yeah, well, so I mean, in downtown Toronto, the real race is going to be between the Liberals and the NDP. It's not likely that the Conservatives will pick up any seats in the core 416, as you say. As you get out into the suburbs, the so-called 905, there are a lot of two-way races between the Conservatives and Liberals. Climate change is a big factor here in Ontario, probably more is competing more with affordability, especially in those 905 areas. But what's interesting is the Conservatives staked a lot of their platform and their early strategy in this campaign on attacking the carbon tax. I think you saw that attack wane a little bit throughout the campaign. It didn't, and of course, to be clear, I'm a carbon tax advocate. I believe it's the most cost-effective solution. So I'm happy to see them stop talking about it, but it did seem as though it didn't resonate in the same way they had hoped. And so my guess is that while climate change is going to be a factor here in Ontario, I don't think it's going to be the driving force that some people predicted it would be. And if anything, we may find, and we'll know once we see the data, that the bigger role climate change played was in peeling off folks away from the Liberals towards the NDP and Greens.
See, that's very interesting because this has been described as a election about personalities and about scandals and mistakes that the leaders have made while on the campaign trail, and not a whole lot about policy. And I think that is fair to say about the climate policy because you and I did a little video where we talked about why the mainstream media tends to equate the Liberal and the CPC climate plans when they are not anywhere close to being equivalent.
Right.
They're just not the same.
Right.
These two things are not the same if you remember your Sesame Street. So
that's right. I do.
Let's turn our attention now to Quebec. How is the climate issue playing out in the Quebec election?
It's a very big issue in Quebec. I think it's a driving factor, or it's one of the driving factors anyway, I think, in pushing people away from the Conservatives in Quebec. You've seen their vote share drop precipitously in the last few weeks. The Bloc and the Liberals were the two leading parties there. Both give strong, at least verbal, attention to the climate file. And you see when this issue came up in the French debates, the Liberals and Bloc were pretty much on the same page here. So Quebecers have generally been at the forefront of pushing for climate action, whether that's the results you see in polls or whether you see it, of course, in, for example, the rallies that have been held in Montreal over the last number of months. 300 to 500,000 people out for Greta Thunberg. So I think climate change is a really important factor in Quebec. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Conservatives, and we'll have to see how the results go today, but why the Conservatives, if they don't perform to their expectations, if they don't form the next government, will likely want to revisit their climate change policies to ensure they have a more credible plan.
That now we could spend a little time on that because I've been, and as you have been, critical of the CPC basic approach to it. This is not a matter of the three general policy tools in the toolbox, which is carbon pricing, rules, regulations, and standards, and then thirdly, subsidies. This is all in on subsidies. So this is quite a substantial, as you and I agree, a substantial departure from the other parties and really from Canada's historic approach to this issue. So let's move now down to Western Canada. I think we can dispatch Western Canada from Manitoba to Alberta pretty quickly.
There's going to be a blue wave there.
Yeah, that's where the Conservatives have got their stronghold.
Yeah.
And climate is, if anything, it's, especially in Alberta, Saskatchewan, even in Manitoba, it's not a big issue. So now what about BC? What role has the climate issue played in British Columbia?
Fascinating in BC. It's played a very big role. And BC really is, and you can say this about some other provinces too, there's a number of subregions where you see different dynamics in the different subregions. So you have Vancouver Island, where you've got a number of four-way races between the Greens, NDP, who are thought to be in many of those races the leading two parties, and you've got the Liberals and Conservatives in play too. A big reason there is the climate file. I mean, the Greens is where, the Vancouver Island, rather, I should say, is where the Greens have their only 2 seats in Parliament today. I think they have a real hope of picking up a couple of additional seats there. And climate change is very much a driving force behind that conversation there. So that's Vancouver Island. Vancouver proper, you have more of a dynamic, Vancouver and the surrounding areas, I should say, lower mainland often it's referred to. You have a dynamic, I'd say, similar to the 905 in Toronto, where you've got Liberal and Conservative races that are tight races. In some cases, the NDP competing there too, where you've got climate change as an issue, and of course the pipeline, which goes through, or potentially could go through Vancouver, the Trans Mountain pipeline, that is playing a factor there. And being a drag, I think, on the Liberal vote, making it more difficult for them to talk about being strong climate advocates. But you've got that competing with an affordability message, which is the one the Conservatives are really leading with.
That's very interesting. I had Sandy Garasino on just a few minutes ago.
Oh, great.
She's a writer with the National Observer,
Yeah,
and so we were
terrific.
talking about, because she's Vancouver-based, we were talking about the role of the pipeline, the Trans Mountain expansion. And one of the points that she made, which I thought was intriguing, is this whole narrative around how the Liberal plan and the CPC plan are the same. In Vancouver, she said, was driven by the Liberals' approach to the pipeline.
Yeah.
They both supported the pipeline. Therefore, none of the other policy tools, none of the other policy options were considered. It was all climate, all narrative, all became about the pipeline. Were you hearing something similar?
Very much, and I think the mainstream media use that as part of their narrative too, and I suppose those two forces interact. But to me, it's a real shame, because the pipeline is not unimportant, but I think it's really a red herring. I think people have clung to this as a symbol. I've used it as a symbol of everything good or bad about a party's policies, depending on your position on it. And I frankly deviate from a lot of other advocates for climate policy here, I think. But in my view, sure, the pipeline policy will increase, having an additional pipeline there does increase emissions, but it is 1 to 2% of our total emissions. So to my eye, you can absolutely have a strong climate plan and approve this pipeline. And I think the Liberals have struck a reasonable balance here. I mean, absolutely, we need climate action. It is urgent. But look, we've got a lot of the middle of the country here still dependent on oil and gas, and we have to think about how to gradually transition away from it. And so I think it's a real shame we are where we are on the pipeline discussion.
Well, I want to throw out an idea that I'm sure you'll be keen to discuss. And it's within that context of the pipeline and Alberta oil and gas. What are we going to do with Alberta as we go forward on the climate file? Professor Andrew Leach is economist at the University of Alberta. My readers will know him very well.
Sure.
Has argued that the oil sands, and this gets back to carbon pricing, you want to take you want to mitigate or abate those emissions that have the lowest economic value per ton.
Mhm.
And the carbon price does an efficient job of doing that. But that also means that you want to protect, or one would think you'd want to protect, those emissions that have the highest economic value per ton. And in Western Canada, that far and away is the oil sands and is the
Right.
oil and gas industry.
Right.
So if I'm Alberta looking at that logic, I would say, you know what, BC, Ontario, Quebec, you're maybe going to have to take a bigger chunk of the carbon budget to protect this high value per ton emissions. What's your take on that argument?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, look, Trevor Tombe, another economist that you're probably your readers would probably be familiar with, has estimated that canceling or restricting the pipeline would have a per ton cost of $1,000 or more, $1,000 a ton, right?
Right.
Whereas the carbon tax currently, depending on where you are in the country, is $20 to $30, two orders of magnitude different. So to my eye, there's no question that we need a flexible approach to our climate action policy. And that's the beauty of pricing, is that it gives us that flexibility. It allows us, as you say, to get the lower cost, lower value add emissions out of the economy first. And it gives every individual, every company the ability to choose. So I'm very much a supporter of that route, rather than talking about do we or do we not approve one specific pipeline.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for this. We really appreciate it when you come on and share your insights with us. And we're off to check the numbers again to see where the returns are. So have a great evening, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you about this issue soon.
That's great. Good to be with you.
Thanks.